Hello and welcome to India's World. Britain's historic referendum to leave the European Union has cast doubts over the future of the entire post-war Europe project. For the first time since its creation in the mid-1950s, the EU will lose a member. The impact of this development will push both Britain and the European Union into a prolonged period of uncertainty. Calls for other referendums on EU policies in other member countries could lead to the EU becoming a less tightly knit bloc or even disintegrate. This could fundamentally alter the future of Europe and its place in the world. To discuss the shadow that British exit from the EU has cast over the future of the European Union, we have with us a distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Dinakar Khullar. He was India's ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg and the European Union. Ambassador Vivek Katju. He's been India's ambassador to Myanmar, Thailand and Afghanistan. He retired as Secretary West, looking after Europe in the Ministry of External Affairs. And we have with us Professor Manoj Pant. He's a professor at the Center for Trade and Development at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. I welcome you gentlemen to this discussion. Dinakar, let me begin with you. Now, is Britain's decision to quit the EU a seismic moment for Europe's supranational ambitions?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is. I think the Europeans hadn't factored in this possibility. They thought it will be close, but eventually it will go for the stay campaign. The immediate outcome for Europe is the fears of future possible exits. But I think they'll close ranks. They'll close ranks. They've already, I think, called a meeting of 27, and they'll close ranks and try to prevent anything happening. But it is, for them, I think, unexpected and a major change on how Europe will function in the future.
Vivek, one of the moving political forces behind the British referendum was the UK Independence Party. Such Eurosceptic parties have come up in other parts of Europe also. In France, you have the Front National, the New Democrats in Sweden, the Finns party in Finland. They've all been watching this event closely. Some have even called for their own referendums. Do you think these referendums will take place and go the same way as Brexit?
I think in some cases referendums will be unavoidable, because the UK was is a very significant part of the EU. Now it's leaving, so its example will have a domino effect. But I'm not quite sure if the referendums that might take place now will go the UK way, because now those who argue for the European project will be far more intense in their lobbying efforts. Because while we know the reasons why Brexit has taken place, and they have to be addressed, there are vast numbers of marginalized now because of the entire globalization process, yet there is much going for a European project. And there are many advantages which accrue, especially to smaller countries. So, I think saner counsel from the Remain point of view might prevail.
Manoj, do you agree with Vivek, or do you think that besides similar referendums, other votes that are to take place, other elections that are to take place in the next 12 months, for example, Hungary is organizing a referendum on rejecting the quota provisions for refugees. There's Italian referendum on governance reform. There are general elections in Netherlands. There are presidential elections scheduled in Germany and in France. Do you think Brexit will impact these elections also?
Well, I think what's going to happen is all these guys are forced to admit that there is an issue. Immigration is an issue. Someone like UK to leave. But I agree with Vivek that I don't think that they are going to leave. But I do think what's going to happen is they're going to say, let's address this social charter of EU a little more carefully. Let's find out why did the UK leave. I don't think this is going to lead to everyone else leaving. I don't think so. I think I agree with him.
Okay. Then, does Brexit point to rise of national politics at a time when the world seemed to be moving towards finding collective solutions to global problems, whether it's climate change, it's trade. You also have collective action against those who step out of the international consensus, for example, sanctions against Iran, nuclear sanctions, sanctions against Russia after its annexation of Crimea. So do you see a counter tendency developing at a time when global problems need global solutions?
I certainly see it, but I wouldn't attribute it entirely to Brexit. This is a force that has been moving in Europe for several years. I think you made a reference to some of the parties that have emerged in countries which are traditionally very strongly working towards collective action, like, for instance, Finland or Sweden. So this is a tendency which has already begun in Europe for quite some time. And one of the big issues which the European Union will now have to confront is the whole question of this collective political decision making, which, I mean, the Brits had reservations on that. The immigration issue, in my view, is a bigger problem for the British than for the others, because the immigration that the British are fearing is the East European. Now, that basically was a problem that arose when EU moved from 15 to 25. Yeah. You moved into a completely disparate economic. Till they were 15, they were broadly of the same per capita income, same responsibility. So that change has taken place. It's been taking place for several years. I wouldn't attribute it to Brexit alone, that this kind of change will take place in thinking.
But my question really was not that Brexit has caused growth of nationalism. Brexit was only a symptom of what was already going on. So let me take this question now to Vivek. So do you find this growth of nationalism going counter to processes of globalization, which seem logically necessary at this point at least?
Look, I think, as you rightly say, certain common issues, worldwide, global common issues, require global solutions. The question is, what would be the nature of the global solution? One of the reasons for the rise of this national sentiment is the feeling that the big powers really are ignoring the interests of the smaller powers while laying down global solutions. Partly it's because of the stupendous change that is taking place because of technology. And I, for one, am a great believer in the consequences of rapid technological change, which leaves out masses of people.
Okay.
So that, I think, is going to be an issue which now needs to be addressed. And Brexit has profiled it. It needs to be addressed very rapidly, because Brexit, just one sentence, Brexit is something that has taken place in the heart of the developed world, whereas this phenomenon was being conceived of as something in the developing world till now.
Okay, all right. We're going to discuss the reasons for Brexit and the growth of nationalism in our coming segment, but we need to take a break just now. Stay with us, don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the impact of Brexit on the future of EU. Manoj, is the nationalism that is gaining ground in several European countries a reaction to how EU itself has grown? Because what started as a common market, then embraced single currency, then a free travel zone or Schengen zone, then an integration of justice and home affairs departments of all countries. Has this diluted the core aspect of national sovereignties as states have less control over macroeconomic policy and borders and immigration?
I believe the economics is an excuse. I don't think that's the cause. And I do believe that the cause is one very well-known economic fact, that contrary to what we believe in economics, around the world, and Vivek is right, income distributions are getting unequal. Not just developing countries, also in developed countries. Because what is unskilled there is coming to developing countries and becoming skilled. And therefore, there's unemployment in both areas. Now, that's the starting point. Now, the question is, we were told in 2008 it's because of the world recession. Now we're 2016. And no recession has ever lasted as long as it has. And, there's 25-30% unemployment. So you got to blame something. I believe the straw which broke the camel's back was the Syrian movement. And I don't know if you're going to talk about it, but I do believe this is a major victory as far as ISIS is concerned. They've been trying this for a very long time. How can we create dissension within the Western countries on this issue? I do believe that is the straw that broke the camel's back. The lies which were told that now you're going to lose all your jobs to the Turks, and then there's the Syrians coming, and UK was the last to agree to take that. So I think that's an excuse. Just a small excuse, just a small example. Like, for example, the movement in Delhi in 2012, that rape case suddenly became such a big You don't know why it happened then, but the straw which breaks the camel's back.
In
and I think
psychology, it's called over-determination, but we'll leave it at that. Dinakar, do you think that the enlargement of the EU itself, you pointed to earlier, to include Central and Eastern Europe, countries with different histories, different levels of economic development, but also uneven level of democratic development into one bloc, made the decision process, making process at EU more cumbersome? You had more members with differing economies, different politics. And has this made EU policy less responsive to public opinion? That is what is reflected in some voters saying that we have lost control over our lives and that Brussels controls everything, and in whose interest they don't know.
That's absolutely correct. I'm fairly convinced that the expansion resulted in a series of problems, particularly in decision making. It was a political call in any case. It was not an economic call. They wanted to get East Europeans away from the Russian shadow. Having done that, they're now paying for it in terms of getting decision making done. I mean, the Germans want to do an oil deal with Russia. The Poles will oppose it in the EU. So you have this great difficulty in decision making, and this is reflected actually if you take a look at the voting in the European Parliament elections, which are voted across countries. The voting level in some of the countries is below 20% for the European Parliament. That's how seriously they take, the people take the European Parliament and the European experiment.
Vivek, is this why people in some countries feel that EU is responsible for all their woes, that it doesn't really represent them, and that integrating policies at the level of EU has actually meant a loss of control over issues that influence their lives, whether it's industrial dislocation, industrial restructuring, austerity, privatization, unemployment, job security, or even immigration? These decisions are increasingly follow from what's happening in the bureaucracy at Brussels and not from what people in different countries require.
You know, I might find it difficult to articulate this, but let me try. I think EU bureaucracy represents the forces of globalization. It takes decisions on the basis of what it sees is the rational way in which the world is moving, partly because of the technological change that is taking place. But this creates a gap at the local level, where the persons at the local level in all countries who's losing out in this process sees that his life is far worse off now, even though ironically at the time when, for example, these countries, the new countries, when they joined, they thought it would be better off. So he has to blame someone. And who does he blame? He blames EU.
But often you can't even understand what the bureaucrats in Brussels are doing.
That's right.
I mean, I don't know, Dinakar, you'll bear me out. If you read any of the EU documents, they're written in correct and grammatically correct English. But you have to read them 10 times to understand what they're trying to convey. If anybody who's ever made a bid for a research project or tried to understand what their policy is, I challenge people to understand it in 5 minutes. You know, one page, you read in 5 minutes, and if you understand it, you know, hats off to you. They've developed a language which is inaccessible.
You're absolutely correct, and I think the people of Europe have recognized this for quite some time. The dominance of Brussels is not just being reflected in London, it's reflected across the board. I think Vivek and I are familiar with the texts of EU documents. We've had to cope with them for many years. Brussels has become a law in itself, which is one of the central problems of the EU.
You know, let me slight dissenting view here. I agree with you. You know, and I have seen studies way back in 2000, 2003, 2005, showing that the cost of the European bureaucracy is more than the subsidies which are ultimately given. So remove that and don't need the subsidies either of the taxes. These have been going on. You know, so this is nothing new, that this issue. But I'm just saying that
The question is of inaccessibility of their policy and lack of transparency. You don't know how these policies actually get filtered in a particular way through the lens of globalization, as Vivek would say, and turn out to be something which nobody can understand.
But I'll give you a parallel again. Take, for example, the WTO. It's running the same problems. You know, it's not solving global problems. So people are breaking out into RTAs and saying let's... But it hasn't yet, no one's yet said, okay, now let's stop and get out. Not a single person or a country has opted out of the WTO. They're all there.
No, there are benefits. But
so I'm just saying that something has, it is not only the excessive expansion of the EU as a bureaucracy, it is the fact that the greatest ever experiment of the 20th century, can countries come together to form one country, has broken down.
Okay.
And it is not surprising.
Let me
because we've
quickly
had-
ask you a related question. Why is it that the opposition to creation of a body like EU comes from either the extreme left or the extreme right?
Because they are the ones who are peddling the fact that globalization is not a good thing. And therefore they want
Both
to show
are not peddling the same fact.
really more or less the same.
So the left
More-
says that globalization is bad, that this is a neoliberal plot, while the right says that it's bureaucratic and too many regulations. It's
but
not
even,
free enough.
even the right, if you look at the voting pattern in this Brexit, you can see it's the people who had seen very nice life. We've seen the data on the table in the papers, the older people and the ones who are not part of the sort of current thing. Older people tend to lose from the kind of thing Vivek discussed more than younger people do, who adjust to changes. It is these people who have voted in favor of Brexit. So I'm just saying that it is if you look at the pattern, and you can see a very similar thing happening in the US.
One sentence.
Yeah.
The pursuit of uniformity always leads to obscurity. It cannot but do that.
Quickly.
Well, I tend to agree with my own one sentence take would be that the EU today is in a very, very difficult situation. But I still have the confidence that they will try and close ranks at this
Okay,
point.
we're going to discuss this further, but we need to take a break again at this point. Don't go away, stay with us. Welcome back. We're discussing the impact of Brexit on the future of the European Union. Manoj, you wanted to add something to the left and right coming together to oppose EU.
I've always believed, and I will always say, in India is a very similar example, the left and the right have very similar views on economics. That anything from outside is bad. Except that the solution to that are different in the two cases. That's true. But their motivation as to what is bad about globalization is the same. So I'm not surprised when the left and right come together on these things. As I was saying earlier, same things happen in USA. You've got a problem because of unequal income distribution. Instead of looking at possible methods of redistribution, you say the problem is these guys who've been coming from outside and creating the problem.
Okay.
It's the same thing.
Okay. Dinakar, should Brexit be seen as a new beginning for Europe? Is it likely to be seen as a new beginning for Europe, a kind of a shock therapy that forces EU to look at its governance methodologies, acknowledging the local realities of its member states, and yet preserving open markets, open borders, open skies?
No, decidedly so. I think the European leaders, the governments, and I think the people themselves will be taking a hard look at what caused the decision from the UK, how it impacts them. Just a quick word on the left and the right. The reality in Europe today is that the forces that are being strengthened are the right.
For sure.
It's not. The left has lost ground in the last couple of years.
Absolutely.
I have no disagreement with the point that sometimes they are on very similar turf. But the issues are often quite different because the right sees a different kind of ideology. They have other problems with things such as civilizational problems with other cultures. But the reality is that Europe has to do a lot of navel searching or whatever you might
Navel
like
gazing,
to call
yeah.
it.
Now, Vivek, this is the optimistic view is that this would force EU to take positive steps and take a lot of things on board which they weren't earlier. Alternatively, could it be that the nationalists, the anti-globalization movements, that they would continue to rise and diminish the ability of EU to govern itself?
I think it's early days for that. It will be very speculative. But I do think that EU will find it extremely difficult to carry on as a project unless it addresses two fundamentals. One, greater cultural sensitivity. A greater awareness that different societies within EU itself are at different levels of development, and therefore the German model will not apply to Greece. And lastly, address in some manner, which is going to be perhaps the most difficult, that I'm coming back to this, that the marginalized through this process of technological change and globalization are brought in and not feel left out, because that is there across, and as the British experience shows, across all countries. The feeling today, the feeling till now was that it's really a problem of the Central Asian, the Central East, the Central European states who joined in. But it's not. So unless these critical issues are addressed, and let me add, it's not only for Europe now. This is going to affect the entire project of getting the world together, as you started on common issues. Therefore, it's going to be far more complex now.
Okay. Manoj, do you think that the British case will demonstrate the costs of exit much more graphically than any speech that pro-EU advocates could have made? And that this would actually be a lesson to Eurosceptics elsewhere? And do you think they might have a second thought now?
I think so, and I'll tell you why. It is not the trade thing which I was talking about, it's the services side. What happens is, trade problems they can solve and not lose by simply agreeing, and not that easy, by the way, as Norway, because there was no Treaty 50 when Norway left, so it's going to be very difficult how they work it. But trade is easier to solve if you become part of the single common market. But in services, it is not border legislation or border measures which stop services. It is legislation. Now the question is, what happens to companies, service companies, which is a major export of the UK to Europe? Otherwise, they're importing everything. What do these companies do? Do they open offices in the other countries too? Because now the open movement of people from one to the other in terms of service exports and servicing your exports in other countries, is that going to be that?
So my question is that once Eurosceptics in other countries see the problems that UK faces, that they would tone down their criticism of EU.
No, I don't think so. I think they will use it to raise the criticism of EU. They will say, see, we are telling you, you can't tell us to do everything that you do. We can't do it. I mean, Germany is different, as Vivek said. That part is different, but I'm saying from the EU's point of view, the adjustment is not going to be as easy as they thought.
Okay. Dinakar, do you think that the EU member countries might not want to give a sweetheart deal to the UK now because they've left, and that they might make the exit extremely hard as a lesson to others that this is what happens if you leave EU?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. In fact, I think this, it's difficult enough getting into EU, as we know the process of getting in. But a country which walks out and has spurned them, so to speak, the Brussels bureaucracy is going to make their life miserable in negotiating any kind of economic arrangement or any deal. I saw a statement from one of the EU leaders yesterday that the quicker the British exit, the better it is. They've already said that.
Exactly. So they want them to get out quickly.
They want to get
and
out
show how messy this exit can be.
Can be, so that the others realize that it will be a huge problem. Yeah. After all, the Greece didn't exit through all the problems.
Now, Vivek, could one argue that actually none of this will happen because UK was a very special case. It always had 1 foot out of the EU. It did not accept the currency. It did not accept the Schengen area free travel, and it kept justice and home affairs out. It did not give control to the EU. No other state has this kind of latitude that the British enjoyed within the EU. Now, those countries which are deeply enmeshed with EU, if they want to get out, now imagine what would happen. You get out of Euro, you have to then restart your own domestic currency. There will be a flight of capital out. Who's going to worry? Who's going to think that a new franc or a new Deutsche Mark is going to have any value at all? So the more deeply enmeshed you are into EU, the more difficult it is going to be for you to get out.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that because and that will only strengthen the case of the Remain camp in these countries. But even with the British, I think the EU leadership might try to ensure that the bureaucracy doesn't put the spoke in, and that the divorce is not totally messy. Because wisdom would lie in that attempt.
Maybe they could say it's a separation, not divorce yet.
But I'm not quite sure what will happen to the English language in Europe. That is, and lastly, it will be fascinating to watch, even though that's not your subject of this discussion, fascinating to watch how Scotland now acts.
Yeah, those are things to do. You want to say something?
Yeah, I was just saying that, I think just to reiterate what Dinakar said, see, the in terms of economics, the far bigger case for leaving was Greece. I mean, they literally had to say, look, we put our pants down, tell us what else to do. But they wouldn't do it because the costs of highly integrated EU countries is very high compared to EU. Particularly the currency cost is a disaster, in terms of... So I do agree that I think they will pull together, but they will reform this very difficult way of sorting out any social issues in a European agreement.
All right. We've run out of time. We'll have to conclude this discussion here. I'd like to thank all of you, Professor Manoj Pant, Ambassador Vivek, Katju, Ambassador Dinakar, Khullar, for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again as usual next week. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.